Record.
With a prepared statement,
I'm not sure.
An overview from each of our panel members here, about 5 minutes on their thoughts. Then we'll have some discussion up here, then we'll open it up for audience questions afterwards. And I'd like to start with our rookie, Vikki Goodwin. She represents the House District 47. She said she had a first year that was successful co-authoring the school finance reform law, authoring 5 other bills that became law. She's involved in transportation issues, environmental, and working for a sound budget. Vikki, could you give us roughly 5-minute overview of what you think happened this year?
Absolutely. So I thought it was a relatively good session, especially when you compare it to the session before. What was really cool was coming in as one of 12 who had flipped seats. That was pretty significant because last session was pretty divisive, and this session was very mild in comparison. A lot of times the speaker would refer to it as the kumbaya session. So, you know, everybody on the surface got along pretty well. I was really happy with the school finance reform bill that passed. Could have been better. Nothing's ever going to be perfect, but it made a big step forward for school districts throughout the state, for our school children, and for the teachers. Basically raised the basic allotment over $1,000 per student, which is huge. That cuts back on the recapture or Robin Hood, which had really affected a lot of the districts that I represent. So I represent Austin, Lake Travis, Lago Vista, Leander, a tiny bit of Round Rock, and a couple of very small pieces of a couple of other districts. They are all giving pay raises. Austin's giving 6 to 7% pay raises to their teachers, but also to all the staff. And so that was one of the things that I really liked about the House version as opposed to the Senate version, is that we left it up to the districts to make the decision on how to spend their money on raises as opposed to requiring an across-the-board $5,000 teacher pay raise that wouldn't have allowed for pay raises for other staff. So this way we can, the school districts rather, can increase pay for librarians, counselors, custodians, bus drivers, for everybody who touches the lives of the kids in the schools. In addition to that, it does have a property tax reform component to it. It will lower property taxes 8 cents the first year for the average district and 13 cents the second year. It also funds full-day pre-K for students who are eligible. And what else? It increases the weights for some of our special ed students and ensures that we can give the resources that we need to special ed and to low socioeconomic students. So it does a lot of great things. We also had a bill that will help our retired teachers, bolstering the TRS, retirement, and giving them a 13th check up to $2,000. So the teachers and retired teachers spoke up very loudly, and that had a huge effect on session. So that was great. We got a few other, I personally had 5 bills that passed, and I have to thank Representative Rodriguez for helping with that, since he's on a very powerful committee, the Calendars Committee. He and other committee members determine what gets to the House floor, and so he was very helpful, and I really appreciate that, because without getting your bill to the House floor, you aren't going to get it passed. 5 bills that I passed were all pretty local bills, so each one affected a different part of my district, one of which is Western Travis County has a groundwater conservation district, and in the last session it passed, it was created, but it wasn't ratified. And so this session we had to go in and fix it and allow them to hold an election in November. If it doesn't pass this November, then they also have the option to hold an election in November 2020 when we know turnout will be much higher. Don't know why, but it was there. So another bill was just setting up a MUD up in the Lago Vista area. So really, my bills were able to spread throughout the district and help neighborhoods, which will hopefully help in my re-election bid, because I am running for re-election, and hope that I can continue the work that I did this time in the next session, because there is a lot more work to do. I'm sure Representative Rodriguez will touch on this as well, but we don't have a new revenue stream for our schools. And so while we have a great Texas economy right now, we had about a 16% increase in our state budget. It doesn't accommodate if we have a downturn. What are we going to do then? We don't want to have to pull back any of the money that we're giving to our schools and our students. So we also didn't do a whole lot with regards to the environment. There was a bill that I had co-authored on testing for lead in schools. And if lead were found, it would be up to the water provider to change out the pipes. That didn't get out of committee. With regards to election laws, we had a real setback, in my opinion, with the no more mobile voting. So I think that's very unfortunate. I think it hits.
Can you explain that?
So mobile voting would be a location that moves from one site to another throughout early voting. They use that in my district in particular, and a lot of times in rural areas, because they can't keep like a Randall's may not be nearby. And so they take a van and move the voting booths from location to location, and that is no longer allowed. We stopped some bad bills, and we may get some questions about that, but some still got through. I had a bill on personal financial literacy that would have had every high school student take a personal financial literacy course while they're in high school. It passed the House. I'm pretty close to unanimous. I mean, it really had good bipartisan support. It died in the Senate, and I think it was because superintendents were a little bit scared about having the resources, the teachers, to teach the course. So we're going to work with them over the interim and try to get them to start providing that training to the teachers so that next time around they won't have that fear. So a lot of times bills take more than one session to pass, and so I learned a lot my first session, and like I said, I look forward to coming back so that I can take that knowledge and continue to work on some bipartisan issues.
Thank you, Vicki. So, Eddie Rodriguez, completing his 8th term, from District 51, serving East Austin and Southeast Travis County. He serves on the House Committees for Economic and Small Business Development and Environmental Regulation. He's the founder of and chair of the Texas House Farm to Table Caucus and vice chair of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. Eddie, if you could give us your view here.
Thank you all for having me. I'm going to start off. First, I want to apologize. I have this nagging cough that I've had the last 3 weeks, and so bear with me. I might have to stop and cough every once in a while. That's what the water's for. And I'm just going to maybe update some of that information. It's a little bit outdated. My committees that I served on this session actually were the Calendars Committee, as Vicki mentioned, the Ways and Means Committee, which is the Taxing Committee, and what's my other one? State Affairs. Thank you. And State Affairs. And State Affairs is this kind of catch-all, committee that we hear all kinds of stuff from pro-choice, anti-choice, whatever kind of social kind of issues to utility issues to telecommunications, just kind of the larger kind of statewide type stuff. So it's a pretty big committee. I want to I recognize many faces here, but not everybody, so I'll just kind of introduce myself briefly to you all. So I'm again, this is my 8th session in the legislature. I was there 6 years prior as a staffer. I was chief of staff to my predecessor. His name is Glenn Maxey. It is Glenn Maxey, still alive. And so I had the pleasure of serving working with him and learning kind of the ropes back in the late 90s. And I ran in 2003 and was successful there. And I haven't looked back since. So that's my story there. The district, as you mentioned, is Central East Austin, which has changed quite a bit since I first ran for office. South Central Austin, so Travis Heights area, to South Congress, all the way down to Wynn Cannon. And then also south 5th Street, all the way down to Wynn Cannon 2. I had the airport, I had the Formula 1 track in my district. So it's a pretty diverse district, and it's diverse in lots of ways, not only ethnicity, but also income. I have some tremendous poverty in my district. I represent Dove Springs, for you all who may not know where that is. That's deep southeast Austin, which is a lot of poverty there. And then, of course, you can look at the areas like Travis Heights, where you have a little bit more affluence there. And in my actual neighborhood, which is Central East Austin, I live right east of Rainey Street, or rather west of Rainey Street, east of Rainey Street, about 5 blocks. And I've been there for almost 20 years. And obviously that's one of the more expensive parts of town now too. It used to be one of the more affordable parts of town not too long ago. So I've seen a lot of changes over the years in my district. But I'll talk really briefly as kind of a 30,000-foot way of the legislature as I see it from even in the late 90s, but and also as a freshman member in 2003 to kind of where we are today. And it's kind of gone up and down in lots of different ways. So my first session was the first time that the Republicans took control of the Texas House of Representatives. And so we had our first Republican speaker since Reconstruction. So that I don't want to take the blame for that or anything, but that was my experience. I came in right at that change. So I have not seen, as a Democrat, a House or a Senate, frankly, that has been controlled by my party. So I've had to, kind of work the last 16 years as the minority party, and also being a minority myself, and being an Austin Democrat in the legislature sometimes has its challenges, which Vikki will learn more and more about as her career blossoms over the next years. But it has gotten better. Last session was probably the worst session I've ever experienced, and I thought the session before that was the worst one until last session, which was quite terrible. It ended on sine die with a near fist fight on the House floor. That's how divisive it had become between Republican and Democrat, and that's not healthy. That's not good at all. And so a lot of that had to do with kind of the style of the speaker at the time. You did have a much larger spread between Republican and Democrat, so there's just a lot of frustration. Some of the issues that are important to me, for example, being the policy chair of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, immigration has been this front and center issue for the last 3 sessions, and last session was way up there with was it Senate Bill 2 or SB4, which was this that kind of show me your papers. And it was a very egregious kind of bill from my perspective on the immigration issue. So all of these things just kind of bubbled up until this really intense last weeks of that session. And so between, and then my first session, it was, again, the first time that Democrats had lost the House. And then I saw at one point where there was 101 Republicans to just, 49 Democrats, which basically just meant there was nothing. We couldn't stop anything as a Democrat. And then we got to one session in 2000, I guess it was 9, after the Obama election. In 2008, we were within 1 vote. That was virtually tied. And then we lost a lot of seats again. And the last election, we picked up 12 seats. And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to be part of this as a nonpartisan group. I'm just kind of stating facts here. So that really helped a whole lot. I think the fact that we have more parity now, there's only a 9-vote difference. The House, and I would argue the Senate, works best when you have close to parity, Republican and Democrat, because you cannot govern from the extremes, and it's a lot easier to do that when one party has that much control. So I work with Republicans all the time, and I proudly do so. And in fact, I prefer to file legislation, and the first thing I try to do is find my Republican joint author, right? Make sure that I have the first joint author is going to be a Republican. And it's not just because it helps you pass a bill, which does, in many cases, it'll help, but it's also because, I think if it's good public policy, it doesn't matter what the letter is after your name, whether it's a D or an R. Let's just try to do something and work it out. So this session, we had a new speaker in Dennis Bonin, and he was quite different than Joe Strauss, who was our previous speaker, who had been the speaker for 10 years. And Joe was a very hands-off, and I'll stop. I guess I'm not even following the time. We've got 5 minutes, okay. But just let me know, nudge me, because I can talk.
You go, Sean. Go ahead.
Speaker Strauss is a very hands-off kind of speaker. He let the members kind of do their thing in a way. And Dennis is kind of similar, but the difference is that the speaker was not very present in the sense he relied on his lieutenants to do a lot of things, and so it was very decentralized versus what I think, Vikki, your first experience with Dennis, Speaker Bonin, is that he let the members and his chairman and chairwoman do what they needed to do, but he was very engaged in the process throughout. And that made a lot of difference. That plus the fact that you were closer to parity. So we didn't see as many, as Vikki alluded to, we didn't see as many far extreme bills one way or the other really that made it to the House floor, that's really important. We had a lot of that last session, the session prior to that, and several sessions prior to that too, where these really bad, when I say bad, I'm not going to get to the policy stuff necessarily, but it's very divisive, and then you end up having just a lot of it's just a lot of fighting on the floor, on the House floor. It's just not very healthy and conducive to creating good public policy, right? So most of the really controversial issues didn't really see the light of day. A lot of the, depending on whatever your perspective is on gun control or gun safety, a lot of the more like constitutional carry did not even have a chance to get on board. The bathroom bill, which we all heard about last session, there was no chance that was going to get even a hearing, really. So we avoided a lot of that because I think of the speaker, but also because of the dynamics of the House have changed quite a bit. I'll just mention a few of my bills, and then I'd love to, kind of move on. So one of the things I'll just say some of the issues that I really focus on, I'm very passionate about. Probably the one that I'm most passionate about is affordable housing, and I have been since I was a staffer in the late 90s. I started seeing, when I started campaigning, block walking Rainy Street, when it was actually, houses and people lived in these bungalow homes. What I heard the most when I was campaigning in 2003 was property taxes. And what I hear the most in 2019 is property taxes. And it all kind of wraps around the affordability issue. So affordable housing is something that I'm quite passionate about. The other issue that I focus a lot on is public education, in the sense that trying to, I like to focus on early college. High schools like to have partnerships between community colleges and other institutions of higher education in our public education system to prepare the students for to be ready for the workforce when they're done. And ideally, encourage students to graduate with not only a diploma, but also some kind of certification, something they can do. They can actually work right away, or at least get a couple of years of credit before they go to college, because they just have to get probably student loans, and they're going to be saddled with that. And then, as you mentioned, I formed the nation's first Farm to Table caucus, and it's a bipartisan caucus. We've about 40 members, roughly 20 Republicans, 20 Democrats, and it's really just trying to promote local food production, not just Go Texan, but that kind of stuff, but really small, kind of our urban farmers, smaller producers, organic producers, and kind of promote that throughout the state. And Texas is a great place for that kind of stuff. So real quick, this is probably my biggest bill this session. As Vikki said, it's my third time trying, and it didn't pass. But it got to the furthest that it had gone, and that has to do with community schools. How many people here are familiar with community schools? Not communities in school, but community schools. So essentially, I'll just really briefly, it's a kind of wraparound, like everything's at the campus kind of thing. It's a way to turn around schools that are underperforming. So you have programs there for parents and for the kids. You have buy-in from the community, and it really has worked to turn things around. So I tried to put that in statute so that it's in the law, that our school districts know that this is a way that they can turn around their school. And it made it all the way to the Senate. It just died literally the last day a bill can possibly pass. It just didn't make it across the finish line, so that's disappointing. And then I passed a cottage food extension of the cottage food laws, which allows people to sell from their home a little bit more freely, be able to sell. Let's say you have a baked goods or something like to that effect, or nut butter or something like that. You can actually sell it online, and just kind of, for me, it's also a way for people who are entrepreneurs, that they want to, start a business. They can start it from their home. It's just kind of I think it's a very important economic development tool, really. And then probably the one that got the most, press this session was my Beer to Go legislation, which did pass through amendment. I'm happy to talk to you all about that offline or whatever, but it was quite a unusual way to pass a bill. So basically now in Texas, if you went to a winery in the Hill Country, you can have a glass of wine. You can buy a bottle of wine to take with you, or 2 or 3 bottles of wine. You can do the same thing at a brew pub. You can do the same thing at a distillery if you go to any distillery in Texas. But you couldn't do that at a brewery, right? At a craft brewery. Well, now with this law that passed and the governor signed it this past weekend, now they can sell up to 2 cases of beer to go. So that's that.
Thank you. So I've been in Texas about 10 years now, and I never expected to hear the phrase "kumbaya" and the Texas legislature in the same sentence. Did we really do a good job of avoiding the culture wars? I mean, we did have the Chick-fil-A bill. I think there were some abortion bills in there.
Yeah.
What happened? Why was this different?
Well, I think it's because it was the number of those controversial bills that we were exposed to on the House, but there weren't as many of them, is basically what it is. I mean, there was a Planned Parenthood bill that was kind of contentious, and that was really personal to me because it directly impacted a Planned Parenthood in my district, the one Planned Parenthood that this would affect. But it ended up being much broader than that. It affected a lot of women health and lower income people and the access to healthcare. But I think it's just the number of them just wasn't as many of them out there. It's basically that there wasn't an appetite for it.
Vikki, what did you expect? Were you surprised?
Well, given that the prior session had been so divisive, I guess I was prepared for more bills that would have been divisive on the House floor. I was happy to not have a lot of them make it to the House floor, but part of that was because of the work of some of the freshman Democrats and some of the others doing what we call chubbing, which kind of slows the process down. So basically, we came to a point where we saw, it was interesting, in the beginning of session, it was all really easy bills that was like, well, yes, 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 they were all good. They were all made sense. And then as it got closer to the end of session, it was like, oh, now we're getting to those bills that aren't so good. We've done all the good stuff, and now we're getting to some tough issues that probably don't have any business being on the House floor. There was one that really didn't change law, to be perfectly honest. It was already in state and federal statute that if a baby is born, you take care of the baby. But it was one of those issues that they brought to the House floor to divide us, to use in primary elections.
That was after an attempted abortion?
That was that.
Right, the baby born alive, if a baby is born alive, a doctor's going to take care of that baby. It's already state and federal statute. And so really the bill was meant to, and is being used in election material. Those Democrats would have babies killed after they're born, which is crazy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're not going to get rid of that. You're always going to have that kind of grandstanding. And so we did have some of it, but we didn't have as much. And Vikki mentioned kind of how the bills, when they came up, like the first bills were quite easy. That's usually the case. But the difference with this particular speaker is he really put it on the chairman of the committees to not let some of this stuff out. And if they do, then that's where I come into play and the calendars committee comes into play. It's so late in the session that you can slow it down so it doesn't actually make the floor. Or if it does, it's so late in the calendar that you're just not going to get to it. And that's all, understood. Whereas last session, you had some of these things that were voted out very early in the session, and it was you were going to get to it at some point. So it was a lot more accountability on the part of the chairman.
Did either of you see any good examples you can cite of people working across the aisle on things?
Well, sure. I mean, most of my bills had support from both parties and were really nonpartisan. Like I said, they were pretty local bills. The financial literacy one, I think most people agree that our young people, there's currently $1.7 trillion worth of student financial debt. And so this is something that's meant to help prepare them when they get out into the real world, how to budget, how to understand loans, how to understand your credit and credit scores. And so that was bipartisan. I had a transportation bill that didn't make it. But again, to me, saving lives on our Texas highways is a very nonpartisan issue. But I had to work hard to let people understand what I was trying to do with it. Because it came towards the end of session, I tried to amend it to another bill, and at that point in time, some of the other party were upset with me over the chubbing issue, and so it got caught up in those politics. But I tried to go around one by one and say, look, we have lost a life on a Texas highway, one life at least every day since November 2000. And after session, right after session, TxDOT actually came out in the Statesman. There was an article about they're trying to reduce the number of deaths on Texas highways, and they're working on something. Well, that's exactly what I was doing, trying to set up a law that would allow them to create a safety corridor similar to a work construction zone so that if somebody is speeding, the fine is doubled. And you have to work with law enforcement to enforce that, but the idea is that people are driving and not paying attention. They're speeding, and so perhaps if you make the fines higher, they'll pay more attention. I had a lot of different reasons for people not to support it, but one of which was, well, what if I don't want it in my district? And so we added some language saying it had to be requested by a locally elected official. So each time we came across some opposition to it, we tried to address that. And so it took going member to member to member and trying to understand what their opposition was and overcome that.
I mean, I think the biggest example of the bipartisanship was the school finance bill. I mean, that was, I think, unanimously voted on. When it was laid out, there was a press conference, and there were probably 80 people jam-packed, members rather, Democrats and Republicans jam-packed for the press conference and laying the bill out. It was really because everyone benefited. There wasn't, I don't think, a single district, if there was, it maybe a handful of districts that didn't do better, financially at least, with this bill. And I think it was a well-thought-out bill, and the end product wasn't quite, I think the House version was excellent, and the end product was a little less money and a little bit, didn't do all the things that we wanted. But that is the prime example on a school finance bill to have 100% of the House voting for it. That just doesn't happen on education bills like that. It just doesn't. That big of a bill. I mean, it doesn't happen very often. So that's probably the best example of bipartisanship.
I'm curious, what is the culture like between the parties? Do you have friendly social interactions now? Is it everyone sticks to their own group?
No, I mean, I socialize with a lot of my Republican colleagues. Probably more so than some of my Democratic colleagues, actually. Just because of why, but just turns out that way. But I have some of my closest friends are Republicans in the legislature, just for whatever reason. And I think it's important to go out of your way to socialize with the members of the opposite party, because sometimes, in previous sessions, it would get so divisive that there was a bill that didn't really it wasn't controversial, didn't do a whole lot of stuff. It was almost even local to your own district, and you would still have every Republican voting against it for some principle that, okay, well, it's not conservative, and it's a tax bill. Well, it's a tax in my district if the voters approve the tax. But it was one of those kind of things. That kind of, when you develop those relationships, you can, they won't toe the party line, and that could both sides. If it's something that's, pretty much, not controversial, So I think that's what makes Texas so much more different than in D.C. My understanding from my congressional friends, and I have some of my former colleagues that are now in Congress, Joaquin Castro and Mark Vesey and others, they don't socialize with Republicans at all. I mean, they don't even talk to each other. It just doesn't happen. And that just can't be, that's just not a good, I don't think a good thing.
Your impression?
I spend time with some of the Republicans. Just the other day, being on Homeland Security Committee, I was invited down to the border. And it was myself and Mike Lang, who is a Republican from, oh gosh, now I've forgotten, somewhere near Fort Worth. But socializing, not yet. I mean, there's just not enough time in the day to really, for me to have spent much time with the Republicans, other than the events that are set up for us, like going down to the border, or the meetings and dinners and things that you do with your committees. It can be hard, when you don't see eye to eye on issues, but I do my best.
Well, you just try not to talk about that's the trick, right? You don't talk about it, that's why, when I started the Farm to Table Caucus, why it was so successful, and it was bipartisan to start with, because food is not blue or red, it's food, and everybody likes it, and, trying to bring a ultra-conservative, polar opposite of me to a farm to table restaurant in my district in Austin, how are they going to say no to that? We're going to talk about our kids, and we're going to talk about anything else, and it just can't work. I'm curious, I know you're monitoring, ask a question. How many freshmen Republicans were there with this passage?
9.
And there were how many freshmen? 12?
17.
17 Democrats?
Yeah.
And of those freshmen, there was how many women, freshman Republicans? Was it only
1 or 2?
Not very many.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
There's not as many Republican women.
That's been one of the biggest changes in the House. Has been, it used to be a whole lot of more Republican women than Democratic women in the House, and it's completely flipped over the last 2 sessions. Sorry.
So there were a couple things that got brought up, but didn't go anywhere. Like daylight savings time. Did nothing to regulate scooters, marijuana legislation. And they did nothing to protect Confederate monuments. Now, in all seriousness, what are the big things left undone at this legislature?
Healthcare.
Healthcare. Environment.
Environment.
Yeah, the environment's always, that's always been, Texas has always lagged behind on that issue, in my view, regardless of which party is in control. It's just, industry is very influential in the state. I will say that I did file the scooter study bill. I couldn't believe it didn't pass. I mean, it's just a simple study, like how are we going to regulate these guys? It's just, where I live basically downtown. I mean, either they're going to hit me or I'm going to hit them. It's insane. So we got to kind of look at, I think my kids ride it. I want to make sure that we have some kind of regulations in place. There's a lot of stuff that's left. There's always stuff to improve. I still think, as much as I think the public education school finance bill is a good one, it's not sustainable long term. I mean, we're not going to see the savings. We're not going to see the money coming to the schools in the same amount until we have a dedicated revenue source. And this does not provide a dedicated revenue source. Now we have this rainy day fund, as it's called, with this kind of massive savings account that we have. I think we had $12 billion in it, maybe a little bit more, but I think we chipped away at some of that for this bill. But that all depends mainly on oil and gas revenues, and so oil and gas goes up and down, up and down. It's not sustainable. It's been really good for a while, but who knows in 2 years, 4 years, 5 years. So until we find a dedicated revenue source to equitably fund our public schools, this issue will come up again and again and again.
Can I ask a question? We'll get to questions in a little bit. Between now and the next legislative session, if I'm doing this math right, we have 2 more hurricane seasons. We brought up environmental issues. Is the Texas legislator just moving slowly on that? Or are they not moving at all and you don't see them moving at all on that?
I don't think they're moving at all on that. In fact, Representative Zwiener had a bill that would say employees of state agencies are allowed to use the words climate change at work, because she had heard right now that they can be reprimanded for talking about climate change at work. I think we have to get past that, and one of the bills that I joint authored was to set up a commission that would study ways that we can address climate change in Texas, and that didn't even get a hearing. Another thing that we didn't move forward on is redistricting, or setting up an independent redistricting committee. That's going to be huge, and it just, I don't know if it had a hearing in committee, but didn't get out of committee anyway. Representative Howard has tried for several sessions to set up something that would take it out of the hands of politicians and put it into an independent redistricting committee, which we need to have a way to set up congressional districts and state districts so that politicians aren't picking their voters.
Well, that was another improvement. I was on the redistricting. I think I was on redistricting last session, and we didn't even meet. The committee didn't even meet, and I think there was some meetings this past session. Although I'm not sure about that bill, but Representative Howard's worked on that for a long time. Several members have actually. But to answer your question quickly on the environmental stuff, I agree with Vikki. I still think the legislature just hasn't moved at all on important environmental issues. I'll just give you one example. As I've had a bill that I didn't file it this session, but I filed it the previous 2 sessions, which said that if a company pollutes, the fine that they would get has to be more than the economic benefit that they had when they polluted, and that never passed. I think I got a hearing on it one time out of the 3 times I filed it, or 2 or 3 times I filed it. It's very simple. Like if you're not going to You'll pay if you're a polluter, you'll pay the fine all day long, and you still make millions of dollars because of the fact that you're polluting. So it's frustrating if you're an environmentalist in the legislature, because that is one thing where I have not seen the needle move since I've been in office.
There was one bill that we have what's called the TERP Fund, the Texas Emissions Reduction Program. Money has been coming into it, and I think we've got over $1.5 billion in the fund, but we use it to balance our budget, and it doesn't get appropriated. And so there was a bill this time that would say any new money coming into it, we're going to set up a new fund outside of the general fund. It's going to be its own account, and we're actually going to appropriate all of that money in the next session. So we did one thing. I thought that was really good. And we also, in November, y'all will be voting on a constitutional amendment that will take this sporting goods sales tax and put it towards our parks. It should have been going towards our parks, but it hasn't been, and so this will say that that money has to go towards park maintenance.
Does that include license plate fees for Texas Parks and Wildlife too? Because I quit buying the place because I knew the money would never.
The money wasn't really going, the money wasn't going.
No, that's why I quit buying the place.
Yeah. This one should be more actual dedicated fund. How much it brings in, I don't think it's not the same amount every year, but we'll see. It's something at least.
I get 2 more questions and we'll open up to the audience. Okay. Is the next session the one that deals with redistricting?
Yes.
I know there's a lot of interest in this group in that topic. Any thoughts on what people can do between now and then to help push us along to a more equitable redistricting process?
I would reach out to the chairman of the redistricting committee and ask when are the meetings being held. So they're supposed to go around the state during the interim and hold meetings in different locations throughout the state and hear what people want as far as redistricting goes. And, Cheryl Cole is a local representative who's on that committee, so it might be reaching out to her, asking when are they, where are they, can we get one in Travis County? I honestly have been so busy that I haven't done my homework myself, but.
I talked to the chair of redistricting and he's committed to doing that. I think that will happen, and I'm sure follow Vikki and me on Facebook or whatever. That's an extremely important issue to me. I've gone through 3 or 4 redistrictings as a member. So my first session was 2003 when we did the congressional redistricting. Where I'm originally from McAllen, Texas, down in the valley. So that's when they had Lloyd Doggett represented me in East Austin and my father in McAllen, Texas, right now. And that's the year that 51 Democrats went to Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I was one of those. So that was my first redistricting. I've gone through 3 of them. I've drawn all the Travis County maps the last couple of redistricting. Working with my colleagues, obviously, in the delegation. But so this is a very important. One of the more important redistricting sessions coming up that I think that I'll ever be involved in, to be honest with you. It's critically important. And it's harder to do. Now, I can talk about redistricting a lot, you all know. I'll be happy to answer the question, but I think the numbers, the demographics in Texas have changed dramatically over the last 20 years to where it has to be unconstitutional to draw some of the districts the way I know some of these folks want to draw them. Because there's too many minorities in the state of Texas now that in order to maintain this one-party rule, you would have to pack minorities in an unconstitutional way or dilute minorities in an unconstitutional way, I believe. So it's going to be a very interesting redistricting in the next year session.
I have one last question. I suspect many of the people in the audience have this fantasy of someday being in the Texas legislature. So Vikki, if you could indulge us for a moment, what is it actually like to be a freshman legislature here?
Oh gosh, it's very chaotic on the House floor. It's very chaotic in your office because so many people come to visit and there's so many ideas coming at you about things that need to be done. So it's a huge learning curve and you've got like no time to learn. Because you get, the election's November, you start in January, you basically have to create your staff, hire your staff, figure out what bills you're going to file, figure out how to file a bill, how to get your bill through the whole process. So it's an incredible learning curve. It's a lot of fun at the same time. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed getting to know all the other members, figuring out the mechanics and how to get a bill passed, but it's a lot.
That's great, thanks. I'm going to ask Dan to help with picking the audience members here. We're going to do this, the usual process. We're trying to have a diversity of geographical locations within the audience. We ask that you have a brief question, or we'll tolerate a brief comment as long as it's brief. And if needed, will be one follow-up question to either of our panel members. What we're trying to avoid is long speeches from the audience or long dialogues going back and forth of an argument with the panel. Okay? Got that? Dan?
Yeah, go ahead.
Two things. One, real quick. Any chance that we might get a state income tax? And any chance we might legalize marijuana?
I think that the feds are going to have to legalize marijuana or decriminalize it before the state of Texas. I just firmly kind of believe that. I think that we'll decrim some of it, like it's certain amount, whether it's an ounce or whatever that may be. We're getting closer and closer to that. And I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for that, actually. And a lot of it really stems from our criminal justice system, and that you have so many people that have been incarcerated for minor possession of marijuana, and it ruins their life. The way I was just listening to a podcast today, and our criminal justice system is broken. There's no other way of saying it. And so I think we do have some bipartisan support with that. As you may know, I made the decision in my freshman session to file an income tax bill. I got a hearing on it. I'm happy to talk about that offline. But I got a hearing on it. It was the first time an income tax bill had gotten heard in like 20 years. So I don't think that's coming anytime real soon. But I think that things just have to align in a certain way where where people would even look into it.
That would eventually require a constitutional amendment vote on the public.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's why I think it's the easiest actual vote for legislators to make, Republican or Democrat, really. I mean, if you look at, okay, here's what we want to do to pay for public education, a dedicated revenue stream or fund, but if you have an income tax, it'll do that. Well, we can argue the merits here and there, but we can't decide as legislators. The voters are going to end up deciding that, which is something that Bob Bullock, gave us back in the early 90s, I guess. And so it's not really a decision of the legislature, it's a decision of the people. It would be our job as legislators to find probably the best one, if we're going to have one. What's the best one, the fairest one, and the one that can provide the most, revenue to what we were able to go.
Well, I believe in November, you're actually going to be voting on a constitutional amendment that would say we can never have an income tax in Texas.
Wow.
So rather than going...
Did that pass?
It did.
Well, but can I interrupt?
Yes.
Well, here's the thing about that, y'all. The thing about that is that is a paradigm example of just political theater. Because the reality is, you can't bind future legislatures like that, right? You can put that in the Constitution, and then another legislature will put another constitutional amendment that says that only the voters can approve it, or you could put it before the voters. Period.
But my concern is that it would wipe out the prior constitutional amendment saying that if an income tax were to pass, right now it's set up that it would eliminate, or 75% of that would eliminate 75% of your property tax, and the remainder would go to fund schools.
Right.
If we were to pass this current constitutional amendment, it seems that would eliminate that setup.
You'd have to set it up again if
Right.
future legislature have to set it up that way,
Right.
or have a whole different idea. Like the bill that I had was very specific to getting rid of the maintenance and operation of our schools. That's the only thing it was going to pay for, right?
And then,
Or paying for them.
to speak to the marijuana issue too, it was Representative Joe Moody had worked so hard on the decriminalization bill this time around, and I think got unanimous out of the House, and just almost immediately after that, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said, well, it's dead on arrival over here, which was just so unfortunate, after all of the hard work. Representative Moody had even gone to the governor to say, how can we get this bill to pass? And the governor had said, well, you need to change this, and so he was really working hard to try to get this through, just to have it die in the Senate.
Other questions? Yes.
According to multiple studies, the sea level rise will cost trillions of dollars in the next couple of decades just to move ports and sea walls and even transatlantic cables and infrastructure. Is that what it will take for Texas to have trillions of dollars of expense? Because we have the largest coastline. I think of them almost, maybe Florida has a larger coastline. We have almost the largest coastline. But sea level rise is already hitting us. Could an emphasis on that issue, the cost involved of not doing anything?
My experience in the 16 years in office and then the 4 or actually 6 outside as a staffer is that the legislature moves like very, very slowly. And when it has to move, it will move. So it's not to say, okay, if we don't do this now, in 10 years, it's going to cost $1 trillion a year. We're going to have to start, disaster has to hit before I think the legislature acts when it comes to something that large, something that big. So that's been my experience. I don't want to sound doom and gloom. I just say that's my experience has been that when stuff starts actually happening, and your cities along the coast are being, decimated.
Like already in Miami.
Yeah, then we start moving. But I think it's the credit of the legislature when the legislature does decide to act. Many times it does so in a pretty responsible way.
But they have to be pushed.
But it has to be pushed.
Okay.
Seems like we operate in crisis mode.
Yeah, all the time.
Okay, other hands in the red shirt there.
Can you discuss the inequity of property tax on commercial property as opposed to residential property, where commercial property is not really paying their fair share of the true value of their property, which means that homeowners are paying more? And what can be done to change that?
You want to take that one? Start off.
Well, let's see. So one of the freshman legislators tried to pass or filed a bill on sales price disclosure, thinking that that would help across the board for commercial and residential, just to make sure everybody is being assessed fairly. It didn't get anywhere because honestly, the Texas realtors have a very strong lobby. And I imagine she will try, she's posted on social media, you have to have the information to be able to come up with the values. I've heard in Travis County, because I met with the chief appraiser from Travis County, she feels like in Travis County the commercial properties are appraised pretty accurately, but that may not be the case throughout the state. So I think without having more transparency and that sales price disclosure, it's difficult to know for sure if properties are valued appropriately.
And what can citizens do now?
Well, I think when speaking to your legislators, obviously the appraisal district does a lot of that here. I think Vikki's she's correct. I think Travis County is pretty good at kind of balancing it out. But one thing, this was my first session on the Ways and Means Committee. This is the one thing that I don't know why it didn't dawn on me, but so on Senate Bill 2, which is the kind of the revenue cap for cities, that passed. I had an amendment that got on there, got stripped in the Senate, that basically allowed cities to look at the homestead exemptions that they provide, and some cities provide up to, I think it's 10% or 20%. Austin does provide, I think a 10% homestead exemption. And it was like pulling teeth to get support on the Republican side for that. And the reason being is that the business interests, they don't like homestead exemptions so much because it somehow negatively impacts them. It was just the weirdest thing. I couldn't understand why. I had a lot of really high-level Republicans that didn't like that amendment. And I said, well, don't we want to encourage homestead exemptions? But it's just one of these weird kind of dynamics. So I don't know. I think that the answer is probably we do some disclosure on what property sells for. But we're the only state, I think, or one of very few that don't have that sales disclosure on the residential or commercial side. So.
Okay, other questions? How about in the back there?
Me?
No, behind you.
One of the strangest procedural quirks I find is the game of chicken that sometimes occurs over sunsetting agencies. A few years ago, I believe the House nearly voted down the Water Commission, and this year it's the Plumbing Board. How is this process viewed internally within the legislature? Is it still favored? Is it still desired?
Buddy?
Do you mean the sunset process?
Yes.
It's an interesting process, being new. My perspective is that a lot of that work is done outside the legislature, and then they come into your committee, have a quick hearing, a few questions, and then you vote on it. So in my opinion anyway, I feel like we don't really know very much about what happened during the sunset process. We get a very high-level overview, and then we vote on it. And when that plumber bill came to the floor, we kept hearing from the plumbers, we don't want to be licensed by the TDLR. We don't want to be moved there and have our board go away. And if you vote this sunset bill down, there's a safety net. And we all heard safety net, don't want to be moved to TDLR, okay, we're voting that way. And then after the fact, we heard there's no more plumbing board commissions. They deal with gas in homes.
Yes.
That's not good.
I think that particular one was, maybe it was a bit of a misread by the author of that particular bill. I'm a big fan of the sunset process. I think, it's a smaller group, so I think it's 5 House members and 5 senators, I believe. But they do the deep dive into these agencies that are up for review, right? Much more so than any, as the whole body of 150 could possibly do. So I rely on the person that's filing the bill that is on sunset, that has like TABC was up under sunset. I have to rely on him in this case to tell me what the sunset committee, what they learned. That's the best way to really go at a committee, rather at an agency, and see what changes need to be made, right, to make it work more efficiently and effectively, is through that sunset process, I think. I mean, otherwise, it's a free-for-all. Now it's up to me as an individual member to say, hey, wait a minute, I passed this bill. It really doesn't seem to be like it's going into effect, which happened with my previous food bills, right? The agency didn't create the rules to make it work. So, I have to kind of ride herd on that to make sure that agency is doing what they're supposed to do, and other agencies that my bills, I think it's more efficient and effective for one big, committee or to look at the agencies and determine these are the best practices. It's been 10 years. This is how they've been doing it. We think if they do it this way, it'll be better, more efficient. I just think it's a better way of doing things, personally.
Okay. How about you in the whitish shirt, the lady in the white?
I have a question about affordability. So I hear a lot about affordable housing just for a certain income. But what about the middle class? Like the average home price, the median home price is over $400,000 in Austin, and the median income is like $55,000. So you have homes for people who are on the lower income. But then this middle part, what do we do? I mean, it seems really hard to.
I don't define affordable housing as just for what maybe you have to make 30% of median family income.
Okay, that's a lot of what I've heard lately. So
well, yeah, now you'll hear workforce housing. You'll hear also, and it's all just kind of euphemisms because they don't want to say affordable because that means poor people or whatever, right? But the fact, it's a very challenging thing that I know we don't have time to discuss here, and so I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. I think you can deal with it to a point with property taxes and what we can do as a state, because I think a lot of this is all in the state, to reduce property taxes. That does mean that we're going to have to come up with some kind of way of, the biggest chunk of your bill as a homeowner is going to be your school district bill, right? The way for the more money the state puts into public education, the more that the school district has to rely on the local taxpayer. I mean, that's just the way it goes. So if we start doing, that's one thing that we can probably do more than anything else as a state to increase affordability. But then you have this thing, and Vikki can talk more about it because you're in the real estate, I am too, by the way, is the market. So the house that I live in, and which I rent, because I can't afford to live in East Austin. Right. When I first moved there, I was paying $600 a month rent. And I don't want to tell you what my rent is right now. It's embarrassing. But if I wanted to buy the house I live in, it's a 3-bedroom house. it's going to be around $700,000. And the market's the market. It doesn't matter, but the property taxes are zero. My landlord, if he wants to sell that house, is not going to sell it for $400,000 because, hey, I want it to be affordable for something. No, he's going to sell it for market. So that's the force that you cannot legislate. And there's just no way to legislate the free market or the housing market, because if it's hot, people are going to, and we have, what, 100 people a day moving to Austin? A lot of them
150.
are 150?
Yeah.
You know, the market problem is it's really hard to address the market problem. And I think one of the things is, and then I'll stop here, let Vikki talk. One of the things is, I think a lot of people we have to kind of readjust what we think about housing in the sense of this. I think the notion, you have to be accustomed to the idea that I'm going to be a renter. I'm going to be a renter and I'm not going to buy a house. In order for me to live close to where I want to work, I'm probably going to have to rent because I can't afford $700,000 for this house. And it's just it's hard for people to do. Otherwise, we have to be comfortable with the fact I'm going to live in Kyle or I'm going to live in Round Rock, but I work downtown Austin because I can afford to live in those two places, but I can't afford to live here. Or a lot of people I know are moving to like Taylor. You know. So it's a very complicated issue, but one that I would love to talk about. So one, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I see it right now going on in Lakeway. A developer came and said, I have two different plans for this piece of land. I can build 225 homes, all pretty much the same in the 600,000 range. Or I can, rather 125. Or I can build 200 and I'm going to have a diversity of price ranges from 350 to 600. But you have to allow me to do some townhomes. You have to allow me to do some condos, and that requires a variance from the city. The people at these meetings, and there were 200 people that came to two different meetings out in Lakeway, they didn't want either plan. They don't want more people in Lakeway. And I say that just because that's how Austin has been as well. The problem is, I know we don't want growth. We're good. We're all here now.
It's
Y'all
perfect. It's
stay
really
where you are.
perfect. When you moved there, it was the right.
But unfortunately, that's not, the supply and demand with not enough supply, with a lot of demand, it makes prices go up. And I don't know of a way to stop that without letting more houses be built. But you have a lot of pressure against the developers, people not wanting.
A lot of density is the key as well. And it takes a mind, change of mind too. Most people want that picket fence in the yard. And, but if you want to be somewhere close to where you work, say you work central, you're going to have to sacrifice something. And it's just, I think people just have to get used to that. I know we had a council member that was here. I guess she's not here anymore. But yeah, I think, with this, a lot of that stuff, the code, the variance and stuff like that has to do with the city. And I think that's really, really important too. But as neighbors, we have to be a little bit more open-minded to, to changing the way we do things.
Change is hard.
It's very hard.
Okay, yes, the lady in the back now.
What effect do either one of you see to Texas, or what impact to Texas would the citizenship question on the census, if that goes through and that's on the census, how would that impact?
I think it's huge, and the Supreme Court's going to come up with a ruling any minute now, any day now. I think it's potentially very, very large impact. I know I'm working with Univision quite closely right now to kind of get the word out via radio and television to people to encourage people to still open the door and answer the question, because you can't be counted. And it's important. We could potentially lose billions of dollars to the state because of undercounting. Because the way, and well, I'm not going to get into that. But I think what it's doing is it's instilling unnecessary fear in some people in our communities that would probably have a serious undercount of anywhere from 2 to 5% potentially around the state, and that can have a big impact on our budgets.
It's not just money, but representation.
And representation.
Representatives in the Congress.
Correct.
Does Texas use the census for our own districting?
Yes.
Okay.
Census is used for redistricting everywhere, I think.
Well, and other states actually have organizing going on right now and preparation, and Texas didn't put any money towards having that organization in preparation for the census. So
I think there's some communities that do it on their own. Like I think Dallas, I think even Austin has a full count committee, I think. But we're not funding it. Other states are spending a lot of money to make sure that people are educated, understand what the forms are saying, and that encouraging people to reply and to answer the form.
and training the people
And
that
training.
go door to door too.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay, sir.
So the legislative session is over, and you've got months and months and months before the next one. And you've got this little thing called re-election that will take a little bit of your time. What can you do, or what do you do, though, as legislators between sessions to work on the next round of bills and work? Okay, and is there anything that we as the citizens can do to help you in that effort?
Well, let me start since I've had one of those in between interims, between sessions. Yeah, for me, I'll do a post-mortem. I haven't quite done it yet, but look at all my bills and just see kind of what went wrong if it didn't pass. And some of it I already know it's just okay. Look, it's just not right. The issue's not right. So I'll take the say 25 or so bills that I had, and the ones that pass, I'll look at what's left and just determine pretty early on if I'm going to do this again or not. Right. And the other thing I do is I listen to my constituents. I'm one of those guys where I'll read the paper online, whatever, and I see if there's some issue out there to say, hey, is there something we can do about this as a state, right? I'll look at that. For me, the open dialogue with people, my constituents, and when I talk to my office about anything is where I get a lot of my ideas. Other than that, it's just I'll look at something, again, like I may see on the news or something and say, well, this is an interesting problem or issue, and then go about seeing how we can do something about it.
But there's no formal process that the legislature has in terms of off-session committee meetings or things like that?
Well, there are interim charges which haven't come out yet. Each committee is going to have an interim charge, but that's more kind of holistic to the issues. Well, there's specific issues, but to that committee, right? So you'll have members of that committee. We can look at some of those issues that come up there, and then maybe, that could be a bill idea, but probably in that case, the chairman or woman of that committee is going to probably be the one to carry that next session.
Right. I think there's a lot of things that go on between session that aren't necessarily legislative. For example, in Lakeway, they just built a new police station, and I did a tour of that when they did the ribbon cutting. They have a state-of-the-art forensic lab there, and so I said to the mayor, so are you going to take some of those DPS, the backlog of rape kits, and try to process them there in your new beautiful forensic lab? And she said, well, we're still working out the bugs. Give us a couple of months. But, I'll continue the conversation with them to make sure, or to see if there's some collaboration that can go on between DPS and the Lakeway Police, since they have this wonderful new lab.
Okay, other questions, sir?
From my side of view, I'm interested actually about your November issue, your November meetings. There is two main subjects which I hope, if it is not in your agenda already, to put it in your agenda and to try to work for it from now. First one is the health care for all citizens. Everybody should be covered. And that is demand from each and every category. Not only the poor people, not only the middle class, also the elite class. The second issue is the education up to 4 years university. And these two issues, it is everywhere in all civilized countries, it is there. And the issue which mainly the senators or the government, they are against that, which they say there is no budget. Budget could be done. There is a lot of expenses we are paying for nothing, for no use. And instead of invading Iraq, instead of going for wars, sacrificing by our people, blood, and so on, we can save such things for the benefit of the citizens. So my request, if it is not already in your agenda, to take the issue from now, both of you, and try to write the bill and to try to contact your colleagues not only the Democrats, as well as the Republican, and work for it, because this is very important for you, and to be re-elected, that will be great as well. That's it. If you need more details, I'm ready to actually to pass by your office, visit you, and discuss this in more details. Because here we cannot discuss in details.
Okay, any responses?
Well, I mean, I think, on the Democratic side of the presidential front, those two issues are being discussed by several of the candidates. So that's a positive thing. I think at the state level, there's, we're a little bit more limited, and those two things are, other than maybe grant money for higher education, more funding for that would be in line for the legislature. A lot of these issues, those two that you mentioned in particular, I think have a much more broader scope and probably need to be tackled in DC, but there's certainly some things we can do at the state level as well.
Yeah, we did have an expansion of Medicaid bill filed this time, probably in past sessions as well, and it just doesn't go anywhere. I know that's not the same as having everyone covered, but it would help. And we'll, I'm sure, keep pushing on that issue, because Texas has the most uninsured people, and that's just not acceptable. And then with the universities, the legislature did increase the universities' budgets by 8%. And I know there was at least talk about more programs where student loans could be paid off if, say, medical students go and do residencies or work in rural areas. They've had these kind of programs for a long span of time, but continuing that type of program where either a teacher or a doctor who works in an underserved area can get their student loans paid off, at least that would help. But I agree. I agree with your issues.
Okay, other hands? Yes, sir, in the back.
I wanted to ask about a particular bill concerning transparency that, if I'm not mistaken, was vetoed by the governor.
Transparency for
Government transparency bill.
Do you have any more details?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know exactly which one it is.
A couple of weeks ago. But more generally, I wanted to ask, do you consider that there are any major challenges with transparency in state government?
Well, I think there's a lot of challenges still left with transparency with state government. When kind of recently with the Secretary of State was kind of involved, I suppose, we're trying to be diplomatic here, in maybe getting about 100,000 people off the voter rolls potentially, and that all kind of just derailed, and he ended up not getting confirmed by the Senate. I had, as the chairman, as policy chair of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, asked for open record requests for the governor's office, DPS, several other agencies. And it was not easy to get, and frankly, the information that I received from the governor's office, it was kind of interesting. I never had this happen before. It wasn't something that was provided to me. I had to send somebody myself, or send someone that I would designate to go to the governor's office to look at these documents. I couldn't look at photos. I couldn't take a photo of it. I couldn't do anything. I had to stay there, which is a very challenging way to see, okay, what's going on here. So I think there's still a lot of work to do on the transparency side from state and local government. I think there's a lot of work to do on that end. I think it's really important. It's really important not just for the average citizen, but I mean, I'm a firm believer in the power of the press and their importance in our society, and I think they need to have all the information as much as possible at hand to educate the people on what's happening.
And you haven't seen any major legislative initiatives?
There was some bills filed. I think Senator Watson passed something in this past session too. Yeah, some stuff passed. I couldn't tell you the details. I'm so sorry. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to know all the details of that bill. I don't know, but I know that there was a bill or two that did pass this session towards that. Do you happen to know what those were?
No, sorry. I know there was a transparency in drug pricing, but I don't know if that passed. The one thing that passed similar to that was the no surprise billing,
Yeah.
And then I just found out that doesn't include everybody.
That doesn't. And I forgot what it was. Like certain health plans, maybe it didn't.
Right, it's large
Yeah.
health plans.
So like 40% of people it wouldn't really help.
Right.
Okay, let's take another question. Yes, ma'am.
So with the final budget that came out of the conference committee, I and a lot of other state employees were very upset to see that all of the raises and also all of the money to shore up the pension for state employees, so people who work, Health and Human Services Commission, state hospitals, parole officers, all of that, so many state employees, like, there was no raises. I think this is the third session in a row that happened. But I know that our union was hoping that this would be the year with the bigger budget, things looking favorable financially, that we'd get some kind of raise, even if not the $6,000 that they asked for per person. But I know the House version of the budget did have a 2.8% raise suggested. But then something happened at the last minute in the conference committee, and of course it's all very secret, and there's just no raise, no pension, like almost nothing for state employees, even most of the targeted raises were taken out. So it was very disappointing for those of us who are like trying to be activists and trying to just keep our state running properly with these agencies. So I'm just curious of because I know that y'all would have supported this issue, but I wonder what y'all's insight is on what's the pressure points, or what is the strategy to try to make this work out in the future? Or is it just like a lost cause as long as the Senate is as red as it is? Or what do y'all think about that?
I don't think it's a lost cause. I mean, obviously, it was a small raise leaving the House to the Senate. You do have to see probably some changes in the legislature, though, for that to stick, I think. But I think the unions are quite strong. I probably have most state employees than any other district in the state, I think, is what I've been told, anyway. So I have state employees, it really impacts Austin in many ways more than in most other cities, right? So whenever state employees get a raise, it really does help the local Austin economy, right? So it's really, really important for us. I think the unions are great. They've done a great job in terms of advocating for raises and pension and all that. So I think just keep doing it. I know sometimes it's frustrating. Trust me, I've been doing it 16 years. A lot of my bills, I've tried 4 sessions in a row to get through, but you just have to keep plugging away. And you have allies like me and Vikki that are going to, fight for it.
And a message that I think might be impactful is to say that, these state agencies hire people, they work for a year, they see that they can make more money and have a less stressful job somewhere else. And so there's a lot of turnover. I kept hearing that in my office. Just in a number of different agencies too. But it seems like that's not a very good business practice. So that might be a good message for, every legislator that, is this how you would run a business? It just doesn't make sense.
They don't want it to run. I'm a former state employee. They don't want it to run.
Well, yeah, same is true with teachers too. I mean, teachers, when I started teaching, 50% of the teachers had long-term experience, and now the average teacher teaches less than 5 years. I mean, this is no way to run an education system.
I agree.
Okay, shall we have another question? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and this is for both of you, and your opinion, please, on the best way to reach out to and enlist the support of your constituents who are under 30.
Who are under 30? I think to get them engaged, you mean, or to get them,
Get them to vote.
Get them to vote?
Not just that, but the issues that might be important to them, or what do you see in your vantage point? What might be important to them, and then what do we as a community need to do to get them engaged?
Well, that's a very important question. I think a lot of them actually are engaged, but not. Older folks like myself, we weren't as connected as I think these young people are very connected to the community, but they have different smaller communities that they're engaged in. And I just think that it's incumbent upon the elected officials to find out what those interests are. I find, for me, this is a personal anecdote, but some of the stuff I work on, like the farm to table issues, really does. It really reaches out to the younger voters. They respond to that. Obviously, the Beer to Go probably got some attention from the younger voters as well. Other issues that we might find really, really important, you're not going to really reach them. Public education is huge, but they may not have kids of their own. It's really not top of mind for them. I think, it's a challenge for us to find out what they're interested in. And to make that connection between here's what's important to you and here's how your government impacts that thing, whatever that is that's important to you. And I think with the young people today, they're so buried in what they're interested in. It's just kind of just reaching out and actually really touching them and finding out what's important to them.
One of the big issues is going to be climate change for them.
Yeah, sure.
What do you do?
Yeah, so, and I've tried to go out to and visit with some students in high schools just to start at a young age and to let them know what their government does for them, how they can get involved. There's a Moms Demand Action has started a Students Demand Action group in the Lake Travis area, so I met with them. And I think telling them if there's an issue that you're passionate about, join a group that revolves around that issue, and you'll find other people that are interested in the issue, and you can then come to the Capitol to advocate or go to your city hall to advocate for that issue. And I think once they start taking a step in that direction, they'll continue to be involved, and so you start young.
Okay.
Two more questions?
Speaking of Moms Demand Action.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to thank both of you for your support of gun sense legislation, and Vikki especially. You know how much we are happy to see you in the House. So there are a lot of bills that were passed, and perhaps you want to just recap. The Students Demand Action is a way for students who have gone through a decade of mass shootings, that's all they've known. We have school drills in the local elementary schools here. It really is impacting our children. So just in general, just to inform the people who are here, what happened in the House as far as the Marshall Plan, things that passed related to gun legislation, that would be helpful.
Sure.
Repeat the question, I couldn't hear.
She was asking about the Marshall program for schools. And so the Marshall program allows anyone on campus to carry a gun if the school district approves of the program and of the person carrying the gun. And they have to go through 80 hours of training. In the past, it was available for one Marshall for every 200 students. This session, they had a bill that would have allowed for one Marshall for every 100 students. But somehow when it got to the floor, it actually changed to one Marshall or more, so unlimited. But again, the school district has to approve of the Marshall program in their school district, and it tends to be something that the rural districts have because they don't have school resource officers. Here in our area, for the most part, AISD has school resource officers, and they have a police officer in every high school, and then they have some more that go between elementary and middle schools. So we don't have a school marshal program in AISD. I don't believe we have it in any of the districts that I serve. Again, I think it's more rural. When the bill came on the House floor, I tried to explain that this is probably more of a rural issue, and I tried to bracket the bill so that it would only apply to rural districts, but that didn't pass.
Yeah, I mean, this was it wasn't a great session for gun safety. It wasn't a terrible session either. Not a lot happened, I would say. There was some on the domestic violence front. The being able to lease termination. That was a bill that I had, but actually 8 members actually filed almost the exact same bill, but it passed. So basically, if you were a victim of family violence, that you could terminate your lease early. Because a lot of times people that are in a lease situation, they sign a year lease, they're in month 6, and then they have an abusive spouse or partner or whatever, and you have to pay thousands of dollars potentially to break the lease to kind of get out of that situation. So we passed a bill that make that easier. But other more important bills for gun storage type bills to make sure that again in a domestic or family violence situation that someone who's got a restraining order, that right now a judge can remove the weapons from that person so that they don't kill or harm the victim, there's just no place to store them. And so I had a bill that was going to provide for a place for the county to set aside a place for this very purpose. But other more substantial bills didn't make it through either. So it was you know, at the same time, constitutional carry didn't really go anywhere either. So, you know, I've learned that you kind of sometimes you just count those things as a success almost, right? If it's something that something really, really terrible didn't pass, and you kind of just chalk it up to, hey, well, that's something.
What about the emergency?
But can I just say one? But what I would say, I was just so impressed by the young folks that have been involved in this issue that I did not see them last session. They weren't as engaged, and then you've had so many mass shootings in schools that I'm just kind of optimistic and hopeful about this issue going forward, because I don't see the kids, I don't mean disrespectful, the young people but I don't see them backing down really. I think partially that's because you'll sadly you might wake up tomorrow and find that, or Monday there's going to be a mass shooting. You just don't know. It's a very sad situation. But I just feel pretty optimistic. I mean, some of these young people are so smart and so engaged, and they don't show any signs of letting up. And I think that's a great for that movement and the cause. I think it's great.
I'd like to do one more question, and if you two can stay after it at all, there may be people who want to come up and have a short discussion with you afterwards.
Does anybody have a good question to end on?
Yes, sir.
I consider it good. This puzzled me when you talked about it earlier. What was the opposition to mobile voting?
I don't know. I mean, that was a surprise to me that was even with.
So fundamental.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think he had filed that in the past. I believe that was Greg on it, still, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think
Cindy knows the answer.
I know the answer. It's a school district close to Houston called Cyfair, and they had mobile voting units. This is the one that was brought up in every committee, where they would take the voting polls for school bond elections to the football games, to the PTA nights, and they claim that that's how they got their school bonds passed.
Right, so I think.
And that's the excuse they gave. Now, I'm not
They
going to
saw
say
it
that
as
that's
bias?
the full reason. Yes, by taking the vote to the place where they thought they would get approval.
I think yeah, this started to come back to me now. It was that electioneering kind of argument that was being made on that. But so what are they, so.
Betancourt and.
I thought it was Greg Bonnet, but I could be wrong about that on the House side.
Greg Bonnet was the author of the House, right.
So what do you do when you have a situation in this one instance that maybe really happened or didn't really happen? Well, let's just ban it altogether, right? Right. State, that's the answer. But I think another issue that's going to be and I did mention it earlier, is so the 2020 election is going to be the first election in Texas in a long time where you don't have straight ticket voting, and so I'm kind of curious how that's going to play out in our next election. And that was a closer vote, if I recall, from last session, but there's a lot of changes. Texas is one of the hardest places in the country to vote. I mean, we do not make it easy for our citizens to vote. And it's tough. So, I mean, and we always have, those of us who want to get the vote out and get as many people voting as possible, we always have an uphill battle because it's just harder to do in Texas than other places.
Any final comments from our two representatives?
I just thank y'all for your time.
Yeah, I thank our representatives, Vikki Goodwin and Eddie Rodriguez, for coming here when you're not in session, although it's probably the only time you can come here and talk like this. And I want to thank everyone in the audience too. I know there's many things happening in Austin, and we're grateful that you made the choice to come here this afternoon. Hopefully they'll be here for a few minutes before everyone wants to talk to them.
And if a few people could help us stack chairs.
Yeah.